And welcome to, we're going to do an overview of contract management within FileHold. And really what we're talking about here is using a fleet of tools that are already available for you. If you know FileHold, you already know how to access all of these different functions, but we wanted just to summarize them and put them all together into one place so that you can have a look at them and see what makes the most sense for your organization. Now, the other important thing to point out is nothing I'm going to talk about in this involves any special additions to FileHold. These are all things you can get right now out of the box. Some of them are standard features, some of them are optional features, but they're all available currently in the product. You don't need to do any sort of custom integration or go above and beyond. There are some other options, and I want to touch on those towards the end of it that may be of interest, that do kind of go a little bit into professional services, but they're minor things, and we've done them before, and they're very easy to implement. But with that in mind, let's first of all talk a little bit about contract management and some of the important details about this. And there's a lot of crossover between document management software, which is the category that FileHold fits in, and contract management platforms. So you'll see that they all are dealing with a centralized repository with some level of access control, so that we're not giving permission to every user to access every single document. We're talking about some level of control over top of that repository that's built in as an inherent part of the software. There's some kind of alerting system for reviews. With FileHold, we have both the ability to do alerts and emails, and I'm going to show you both of those briefly today. But that's something that's very important when something comes up and it needs to be reviewed. You need some sort of alerting system for that. We need something that is searchable by content and for tagged information, so that we're looking through both the matters of a contract, the internals of a contract, and we're looking for any of those tagged information, those metadata fields that help to augment the document. Some level of electronic signature. Now, in our case, we have integrations, and we'll talk about those briefly. I won't be showing a lot of them. We can talk about them. We have integrations with both DocuSign and Adobe Sign that you can do through our workflow function. So when you trigger a workflow, it can pass out through there for an electronic signature. So you can get that marked on the document. And something that has an approval or collaboration tool, which again falls back into that idea of workflow. Now you can use workflow to route for reviews or approvals. We can also do that same thing as a collaboration tool, using FileHold as a platform for that. Now for the specifics that we're going to talk about today, remember that we're going to treat contracts like we do other documents or records. So all of these are standard processes. We're talking about version control for dealing with drafts of contracts, so that as something moves through an iterative process, you can add content to it, remove content, make sure it's up to date and accurate. If you need to revise an existing contract, you can also do that while retaining the original within the system. Different schema or general use of schema towards contracts. So we can have, one schema for one particular type of contract, or we can use a general contract schema for multiple kinds. That's what I'm going to be showing today, sort of using that as an operating model. You can have metadata that's specific to contracts, so information that only exists for contracts or only makes sense for a contract, such as a date of signing is an important detail for a contract, but not for other documents. Again, FileHold lets you drill down and create those specific fields. Database lookups can populate information. So if you have an existing software that already has information stored into it, such as a client list, we can pull that information out into FileHold and use that to look up for one of your databases or against a schema. Matter-centric filing for documents or records. Matter-centric filing is often used in the legal sector for putting documents into the right place, so that when you put something into a file, it immediately takes those attributes. That's our auto-tagging function, and I'll be showing you that today. Workflow for review or approval. We'll touch on this briefly because I think we've all seen workflow. I've done multiple webinars on this before, but again, it's worth taking a look at it and seeing how you can use workflow for processes, and as well too that idea that you can send it out for external approval via Adobe Sign or DocuSign using that workflow as the engine. We can also use trigger events for reminders. We can use events for all kinds of different functions, but for that reminder is where we particularly see value for it within a contract. And then, of course, searching for value specific to contracts. So those pieces of information that are only really important for a contract and remain less important for other kinds of documents. So with that preamble, let's take a dive in and look at some of these specifics. And again, gearing this towards that contract-centric view, but remembering that what we're going to be looking at here is going to be very much something that could be applied to any sort of document. Let's get out of my PowerPoint here, and we're going to take a look at my background. So here we're seeing my FileHold environment. This should be familiar to everybody. We're in the desktop application. I've got my metadata panel open, as I often do because I'm looking at information towards my documents. And in my library, I've created some very primitive structure for myself. Again, this is more based around the idea of a template because this is my working environment, this is my test environment as opposed to a working environment. So you can create whatever structure makes the most sense. If you need to hold contracts in different areas, you can. In my case, I've created a cabinet called legal, a drawer called contracts, and then some different folders, including an incoming, which is where we're going to start. So the idea here is that these are contracts that have arrived. Someone's going to look at them. They're going to do some sort of level of processing, and then they're going to send it to another location, another place within the system. So again, not a complicated way of doing things, but sort of the idea that we're going to drive documents through. So here's something that I've added in today. When we click on it, we can see some of the metadata that's relevant for it. So we're seeing the document name. The document name is actually composed of information that we find within the metadata, making things a bit more useful. And then I've added some fields to this which are more relevant to my use for contracts. So the contract type, its matter number, who's contracted for the parties, the internal reference number, the date of signature, an end date, who drafted it, and if I have any comments. Now, diving into this, we can see that I've structured this to make it easier for information to come into it. For my contract type, I have a list of types that this contract might be that I'm going to choose from amongst that. Now, don't take this as our way of saying this is how you should store a contract. Absolutely not. If it makes sense for you to have a schema for non-compete contracts or an entire schema for property or equipment lease contracts, then you should absolutely create those within your own system. The key for FileHold is that we're flexible to your working style. So we want to make sure that whatever you're putting into the system reflects the value you're going to get out of them. Our reasons for making a schema include different points of organizing. We want these HR contracts to be very different from our legal department's contracts that they're doing with other law organizations, and we want that to be different from sales contracts coming through. So we may make 3 different schema to allow that as a point of control. Our second reason is retention policies. Sales contracts we keep for 5 years after expiration. NDAs we keep for 10 years after they expire. So therefore we want to have a different retention policy that demands that we would need 2 different policies on those documents. We can also talk about the organization, the details for it. If there's information on an indemnity contract that is very different from an NDA contract, then you definitely want to capture that as different metadata fields. Now in this model, because again, this is just a test environment, I've done a simple drop-down for this. And because it's a drop-down, I've also controlled what language people can use for this. If they have a different type of contract, such as a sales contract, we could clearly see that this would not be appropriate here because it's not one of the items that I have available within the dropdown. So my using a dropdown creates that controlled vocabulary and forces my users to make sure they're using the right kind. If this contract doesn't meet that, then it doesn't appear onto there. Again, we can also enter this information in different ways. Again, for my matter number, I've entered that as a text field. You could have that as a dropdown. You could have this as a database lookup if you're pulling it from a case management software, so that you have a case management, and that's going to pull your matter number out. Then we can apply them against the documents. For our date pickers over here, again, we can go into a date mode for it and make sure that we're choosing a date that makes sense as far as how we're tagging our documents to bring them across. So this is our metadata. We've seen this probably before. We've got lots of information onto this and my ability to sort of tag this. I've done a few other functions onto this, such as I'm using the metadata to name my document. So instead of, if I was to change, for instance, the internal reference number from a 4 to a 3 there and save that, that'll update the name of the file as well too, which puts that 3 into it. So it lets me capture that information. Something else that's useful that we've introduced with FileHold 16.3 is the ability to link information between documents. You can do this just by right-clicking on one of the fields and saying, show me everything that's linked by this value, and it'll bring up and show me any other documents that happen to use that same matter number or internal reference number, or whichever of those values is most important for me to find. So again, I can use this to pull other information out without having to do manual linking, without having to go into search. I can just pull that through using that metadata. So you want to think about metadata in terms of what has the most use for you. We can also add information to these as we need to. So if we've gone along, we realize that we are missing a piece of information from these contracts. We don't have anything about renewals. So we might want to build that into here. So we're just going to quickly build a metadata field for ourselves. So I'm going to go over to our metadata fields, and we're going to build a new one, hitting the plus sign up top. And we're going to start off by giving this our name for our field. So we're going to call this renewal period, right? And we're going to make this a FileHold managed drop-down list. This is most appropriate for me because I don't want to give these a ton of different values to it. I just want to choose a few limited fields that I'm going to enter for this. So we'll do 1 year, add, 2 year, add, and 5 year. Now, you might be looking at this and going, well, that seems fairly obvious, 1, 2, 5, that's fine. What if most of the contracts you're dealing with are standard 2-year contracts, and it's an exception to do 1 year, and it's a major exception to do 5? We want to have them in there as options, but they're not the things we use most often. We can take our 2-year and we can move this up to the top of the list so that it appears at the top ranking. This way, when you open up your drop-down, it's the first thing you see. Now, I'd be careful with doing too much of that because the more we go out of order, the more we go away from alphabetical order, numerical order, ultimately the more confusing I think that some of those drop downs can be. We don't want people hunting through them. We just want people using them. But again, we can build a field for ourselves here. In this case, I'm just going to put these in standard order. You can also choose an initial value for these. And I recommend this with hesitancy because what this will do is it will automatically populate that value against the documents. Now, if someone's not paying attention, if somebody is just, mindlessly putting documents in, never a good position, but let's face it, we don't always have ideal employees, so let's not shy away from that. When we're adding our documents in, when we're putting our content into there, if there's a value as an initial value into that, that will be saved as the value for that document moving forward. And the challenge, therefore, is we've now put information on that may not be correct. If I set this as a 2-year initial value and people aren't paying attention and they save that, I might be saying this is a 2-year renewal period when it's in fact a 1 year. And then a year later, I'll have gone, oh, we've already renewed this contract automatically, and now we're about to renew it again. So we've clearly found that there is a problem here within our policy. It's always better, as a rule of thumb, to have no information than bad information within a metadata field. So typically I recommend, unless you have a very strong use case, leave the initial value blank. So there are definitely times when having an initial value in there is a good thing, but in this case, I want to leave it blank because I don't want to put the wrong information to it. Once I've built that, I can click apply and say okay, and that now saves my my new type there. So I've got my new renewal period drop down. Now you'll see it's blank here because I haven't used this in any schema yet. So as with all things, when I build a template, I then have to associate it with a document. So we can come back over to our contracts and we can go to our metadata fields, add to schema, and then we can choose our renewal period, click the checkbox, add, and OK. And that now adds that to my documents. Now, anytime you change your settings, or such as changing those defaults, it might make sense to come over and just do a quick refresh. So it's just going to make sure that the information that you're seeing there is going to be reflected against your documents. So now we can head back over to our incoming folder and we can select on our document, open up the metadata for it, and sure enough, renewal period is there. And now I can take the moment to define that. So I can just say this is a 2-year renewal period and save, and I've now done that for my document. So I've updated that piece of information. That's now part of the system for that. So very easy always to update, to add metadata information to it, to make sure that the information you're tagging to your documents meets your day-to-day functions and activities. Always want to make sure of that. Now, another function of this is this idea of matter-centric filing. And you can see that I've got a function over here, which is an auto-tagging rule on this folder. We can tell that because of the A. And if I right-click on that and go into the properties, we can see what the auto tagging is, which in this case is a delete function because I want to reclassify documents that go into here to purge them out. Now, what I'd more recommend you do is you go into, for example, you go into the properties, and this is for events. So I want to enable auto tagging. That's going to turn on my matter-centric filing. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to choose my event contract document type. Now, this is very useful for figuring out what I want to do for the types of documents coming in, saying they're all going to be event contracts. Because I'm not doing a lot of fine filtering onto this, this is fine to leave it like in this state, and I say OK. And now any document I add into this will automatically be an event. Now, matter-centric filing is a little subtle, a little different than that. So for example, I might want to make a we're just going to clone this folder, and this new folder we're going to call event, and we're going to call this annual conference 2023. And if I've made spelling mistakes, pardon me, just working quickly here. And we're going to put this into the same contract place where I had before. So now I've got a specific folder, again, with an auto tagging rule. Now I can come back into this, and I can go into my properties, and I can be much more specific. So in this case, for the vendor, it's going to be FileHold, and for the contract date, we're not going to choose that. We're going to say that the type of event name is going to be, what's our event name for this? Is going to be annual conference. I can input this information to it anywhere where it's an important field. I can select it and pre-tag it. Now, some of this other information I might come up later on, and they might change document to document. But if I have a known value, I can put it against the document using an auto tagging rule. Now, as soon as any documents come into this, it's going to automatically populate those fields. So if I say OK to that, and I try to add a document into here, and let's just choose one of my testing documents, it's going to come in and it's going to automatically be forced to be an event contract. It's going to fill in any of the fields. You can see the vendor and the annual conference are locked onto this. I can't change that information. By putting this into here, I'm assigning these values to it. So auto tagging is a great function that we often see being used, especially at the municipal level. We see this often used as a way to push information onto documents, and again, we can maintain that with the contracts. One of the advantages of using the matter-centric filing is that it's putting metadata onto the documents, and that lends us back over into the idea of search. So in addition to being able to browse for our documents within the structure, we can also search for them up top. So when I do a search, I can always look for any of my content from my documents. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is my standard thing, I'm going to be searching all of my documents in the entire system for anywhere where that value is found. Now for contracts, we're going to need to be a lot more specific. I can also use this to find empty information. So for example, instead of doing just my generic search, I can come down to contract and I can say, I want to see all my contracts where the end date is blank. What that means is somebody has failed to put information to there. I have null metadata fields and I want to make sure I see them. So I go search, and I have at least 2 contracts in the system that are missing those values for the metadata for it. I don't have anything into there. If I open up my properties for this, I can see my end date is blank. So this is an opportunity now for me to go back and take care of documents that are missing their information. So again, we're able to grab those documents, anything that's been missed, I can find that very quickly. Doing that is blank search. Not the kind of thing I expect to do every single day, but it's often a nice thing to do on a weekly, maybe a monthly basis, just to make sure nothing's been missed in the system. Find those empty values under the documents, very important thing to try to search for. We can do that same kind of search where we know our brand new field that we just added. So we know that we now have a renewal period onto this, and we say, I want to see everything where the renewal period is blank. And I'm going to find most of my contracts in the system, but I could also say in the list, and then choose everything that has a blank of 2 years. And I can find those 2 years. Or I could say, show everything that's a 2-year and a 1 year in search. And I'm going to find this document as well, because I've said, show me everything that's 2 years or 1 year from an in-list dropdown. So it makes it easier to find those points of details. Now, again, you can imagine what makes sense within your search when you're looking for contracts, what kind of things you're looking for. When you know who the parties are, who it's between, we know what the periods are, you know when contracts are going to be ending. That's another key thing. If I say, I want to see all contracts where, and let's use the end date for this because it's a date, I can say a range. So show me all contracts that are going to end between, let's go January 1 of 2024. And let's go with September 1st, 2024 and search. And I find my document there where the end date matches that particular period. So in this case there. So I can say, show me any documents where the end date is going to be ending in the next time period. But I can also do that over here where I can say where the end date is no older than 30 days before now, and it shows me documents where the end date is going to be coming up within the next 30 days. So I can find those contracts very, very quickly using a search. This is the kind of thing that makes perfect use for a saved search. So I can say, I want to see all the documents where contract end date in 30 days. And clear that typo because I hate those. There we go. So contract end date in 30 days. Okay, so now the next time I need to pull that, I can just click on my search bar and I can find that right away. So it's a very quick way to pull those standard kind of searches into there. Again, this is not pushing FileHold to its limits, but I wanted to take a look and see how we're using those date fields to be able to search for ranges, search for fields of information, and find that information come across. Now, something else that we often see within a contract management software is we're seeing this idea of reminders. And there's a few different ways that we can do reminders. Anyone who's seen dates before within FileHold knows about events. So I know that all of these documents will likely have an event because if they have an end date, they have a retention policy. So we can see, I'm just going to go down to the bottom of this, that all of these documents have a deletion date. This document will be deleted on Tuesday, February 22nd, 2028. What's driving that? What's triggering that is our event. So I'm going to go into our document schema, and we're going to go into our contracts, and we're going to see that I've got an event schedule onto this, which is delete using the contract end date 5 years after it happens. So once the end date happens, the timer goes for 5 years and then this purges. That's part of your document retention, and it's more vital with contracts than it is with most other areas to make sure that you're in charge of your document's life cycles. The reason contracts are so important with life cycles, especially because there's a lot of regulatory obligations that you have to dispose of documents when they hit the end of their useful life period. Now, what that useful life period is depends on your document, depends on your regulatory environment, depends on your industry standards. But almost inevitably, there's a point in time where you should be disposing of contracts because they represent personal information within the system that if it was leaked or hacked or found in some way, you want to make sure you're protecting your system from that. So putting in some kind of retention policy is useful. But there's another policy on this that I want to point out, which is a notification. I have an annual review notification on that that's going to use when the date the document was added into the system as a trigger for that. So I'm going to get a notice for that. This is an automated alert. So I could be setting up for these, for example, to say, I have a date of signature. I want these to trigger 1 year after the date of signature. Or I'm using these documents have a 2-year renewal period. So I need to get that reminder at the 2-year mark because that's the kind of document that it is. So again, we can apply those retention policies against these. There's other options too for being able to subscribe to documents, and that's to actually literally subscribe to them. So again, we'll come back over to our incoming folder as we were looking at before, and I can take one of my documents. So for example, this one, and I can say, I want to be notified of this. So alert me of any changes to this document. It'll let me know that I've successfully notified to it. I've also subscribed to this folder. The idea is that when a new incoming contract arrives, I could immediately be notified onto that. And those notices are held up here under the My FileHold section. So in addition to getting an email on it, so I can also get a direct email notification, I might say that each day I'm going to come over to my document alerts and I'll be notified as to what's happened. So we can see that here I had an event contract that Andy checked in. So Andy made a change to this document, and I can see that happened earlier today. So about an hour and 10 minutes ago, Andy did that action to this document because I've subscribed to it. Now I can also use this to manage alerts. So if I no longer need to monitor a particular document, such as that ARMA document that Andy worked on, or maybe I don't need to monitor the incoming folder anymore, I can simply update that over to here. Here's the one I just subscribed to. Let's clear that as well and move that. And then you'll see that that letter symbol disappears from the incoming. Now with document alerts, it's always important. Any actions that you as a user do to a document are not reflected within the document alerts. You're not going to be suddenly bombarded with stuff because you added a bunch of documents to the incoming folder. It's when other users access or modify those documents. And if you're curious, if I go up to my preferences and settings, view preferences, oh, sorry, not view preferences. I want my preferences and settings, and I want my, sorry, did it again. That's bad mousing. That'll happen every now and then. Here we go, alert preferences, there we are. So here I can say, here's my notification preferences. So notify me when the following occurs. when new documents are added. So maybe I don't care if people are taking documents out of incoming, but I care when new content is added in. So therefore I've subscribed to that, but I've also asked when documents are transferred to there. So when someone copies a document over, or when somebody deletes a document and they remove content. So I can be notified either way. I've also sent this to send me an immediate email. So notify me right away as soon as that happens so I can get that notification across and I can take action immediately. Or I can say send a daily summary so I'm not spamming myself with emails. Or I can even turn off my email notifications altogether and just rely on the document alerts. Again, your system, your rules, do whatever makes the most sense for you. So notification subscriptions are a key part of a contract management solution. We want to make sure that's part of FileHold. The other big element that we're going to see all the time is reviews and approvals. So let's take a look at this here. You can see I've got my list of documents. You see that some of these, for instance, this one over here, which is checked out, and this one down here, which I just added, have a little H beside them. It's a little blue symbol. It's a little tight to see on my monitor. Sorry about that. But there's a little blue dot with an H beside it. You can see this one up here doesn't have it. This one certainly does. What this means is that these documents are hidden. They are not available for other users. So I'm going to step away from this user for a moment. We're going to go over to another viewer. So I'm just going to refresh over here to make sure I'm logged in. Just remember, if I'm logged in as Andy, I should be. Yep, logged in as Andy. Let me just cancel this. When I go over to my incoming contracts area, we can see that that PDF that I had there, the one for Chris, is not available in this. And it's not available because it's been hidden. It is a draft. It has not gone through a review or approval process, and therefore it's not going to be exposed to anybody other than the document owner or a workflow participant as the document moves through the system. So we're hiding that deliberately. Now that's controlled by our settings for the document, for the schema. So we go into our document schema, we go into our contracts, go into our contract type, and under workflow, we can see hide versions of the document in the schema until the document is approved. So we're making sure that this document has to go through some kind of review process before it has to be, before it's going to be visible to other people in the system. It's just a draft at this point. We want to make sure it's signed off on before we expose it. Now, running a document through workflow can happen automatically as soon as I add a contract into here. I can also do it manually. So if I right-click on this document and open up my workflow, I can ask it to go into contract approval. Note that I can have a lot of different workflows attached to a document. So you see another one right down here, which is contract due to lapse. So if I have a renewal clause on a contract and I might want to review it prior to lapse, I could do it through a formal review process using this tool. Now in this case, if I do contract approval, it's going to open up and show me my individual steps that I've chosen for the activity. In this case, a supervisory review followed by a subject matter review, followed by an approval for submission so that we know we're going to be sending out to our client. So I've got 3 different actions that I have into this. The purple ones are my review tasks. My yellow ones are my approval tasks. You can build as complex a workflow as you'd like. Again, I have lots of content on that, but the idea here is that once I approve this, then this document would have that H removed and that Andy would be able to see it, because Andy can't see this now because Andy is not the owner of this document and is not involved in the workflow at this time. If Andy was involved in the workflow, as soon as I triggered my workflow, Andy would be able to see the document as part of when that activity came available. You get your notification and be able to go over and do your approval for it. Again, lots of other content out there for workflow. Now I want to point out one other thing with my list over here. And again, we'll go back into our contract approval. I've got a 3-step task. I could, if I wanted to, use the same trigger to send it to an external signature provider. So maybe once I get internal approval, the last step is actually send this over to DocuSign, and I could use, for instance, if I had an email address within this, or if I had a party name, I could then target this directly over. So in that same process, I could route this through DocuSign. I could route this through Adobe Sign. If you're using those providers, we have a connector. So we can hook our workflow into that connector and then launch your document off that way. So we can send it directly to your external signature provider in that same step of activity. If you wanted to send this to a third party, we also have the ability to do that through Courier. So I'm sure you've seen Courier before. Courier is our secure document delivery service. So I can send this to an external user for someone to look at for approval. Now, it's not quite an e-signature in the same level that a DocuSign or an Adobe Sign is, where you're actually seeing a squiggle line on the document, where you can do the difference between initial here and signature here, or those kind of processes. Here we are very much seeing a more, here's a document, do you approve this? Yes, I do, good, and this is fine. So maybe I'm in a small department, maybe I have a new draft of a contract for my employees, maybe I don't have a legal team on board. So I want to route this to my lawyer for them to be able to review this and say, yes, your contract is fine. I can use Courier for that, plus it logs all those interactions within my own system.